John Mearsheimer says, U.S. already lost Iran war. No off-ramp in sight. When one of America's most respected strategic thinkers declares that the United States has already lost a war, is still fighting, the world should pay attention. Professor John Mearsheimer, the renowned international relations scholar whose predictions about NATO expansion in Ukraine proved devastatingly accurate, has delivered an assessment of the Iran conflict that should terrify every American who cares about their country's future. There is no off-ramp. He says the war cannot be won with air power alone. Iran has options that the United States cannot counter. And the longer this conflict continues, the more desperate Washington will become, while Tehran grows stronger in its position to demand terms that America never imagined conceding. The strategic genius that characterized Iranian preparation for this conflict stands in stark contrast to the delusional thinking that drove American decision-making. And the consequences of that contrast are now unfolding for all the world to see. Hey everyone, I'm Michael Harris, geopolitical and military analyst, and you're watching my channel. What I'm about to share with you is perhaps the most significant strategic assessment of this conflict from within the American academic establishment. Professor Mearsheimer is not an Iranian sympathizer or an anti-American voice. He is a decorated veteran of the United States Air Force, a professor at the University of Chicago for decades, and one of the most influential realist thinkers in international relations. When he says the United States has lost this war and cannot find a way out, he speaks from a position of deep expertise and uncomfortable honesty that few in Washington possess. Before we examine his devastating analysis, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment with your thoughts as we go through this together and share this video with everyone who needs to understand why the smartest people in America are saying what Iranian leaders have known all along. Now let's examine why Mearsheimer believes the United States has already lost. The fundamental problem that Mearsheimer identifies as both simple and insurmountable. The United States has not achieved anything approaching a decisive victory over Iran. When America defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II, those victories were so complete that Washington could impose whatever terms it wished on the vanquished. The winners dictated the peace because the losers had no capacity to resist. Nothing remotely comparable has occurred in this conflict. Iran continues to fight. Its missiles continue to fly. Its allies continue to strike American and Israeli targets across the region. The decapitation strategy that was supposed to produce regime collapse has produced instead a unified nation rallying around its martyred leader. The shock and awe that was supposed to break Iranian will has demonstrated instead the limits of American power against a prepared adversary. Mearsheimer poses a question that the Trump administration apparently never seriously considered before launching this war. How do you get the Iranians to agree to stop fighting? When you listen to people in the administration talk, he observes, they sometimes speak as if America is the only player in the game. We determined when the war started. We determine when it ends. We determine the conditions the Iranians have to accept. This is the view from inside the administration. But this is not the way the real world works. The Iranians have a say in this. And the question is, how do you get the Iranians to agree to stop fighting? The answer Mesh suggests is that you cannot, at least not on terms that America would find acceptable. Iran has prepared itself to absorb massive punishment by the United States and Israel. The bombing can continue indefinitely, and the Iranians will not throw up their hands and surrender. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announces that today will be the day of the heaviest bombardment yet inflicted on Iran. Very well assume that happens. Does that mean the Iranians are going to quit? Mearsheimer thinks not. Iran has options, and those options give Tehran leverage that Washington never anticipated. The strategic position that Iran occupies is far stronger than American war planners apparently understood. As the United States escalates, Iran can escalate in response. If America destroys critical infrastructure inside Iran, Iran can destroy critical infrastructure inside the Gulf states and inside Israel. Iranian missiles and drones are highly accurate, operating in a target-rich environment where vulnerable and important economic and strategic targets can be hit with relative ease. The Gulf states are remarkably vulnerable. Their petroleum infrastructure consists of a handful of sites that Iranian short-range ballistic missiles can take out with relative ease. But even more critically, these countries depend on desalination plants for their survival. One desalination plant services Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. If Iran destroys that plant, 90% of Riyadh's water supply disappears. Overall, Saudi Arabia depends on desalination for 70% of its water. Kuwait depends on it for 90%. These countries cannot survive without water, and Iran can take away their water with missiles that America cannot intercept. Mearsheimer puts this in terms that should chill every Gulf leader who allowed American forces to use their territory for attacks on Iran. The Iranians have really serious options here. You could take Abu Dhabi and just wreck it. Iran possesses what amounts to an assured destruction capability against the Gulf states. The consequences of exercising that capability would be devastating for the world economy, which depends on 20% of global oil and gas flowing through the Persian Gulf. Trump talks about opening the Strait of Hormuz. Good luck on that one, Mearsheimer responds. If that were easy, we would have done it already. The Navy itself has told the administration that escorting tankers through the Persian Gulf is not possible because American naval ships would be too vulnerable. And even if the strait could somehow be opened, that becomes irrelevant. If Iran destroys the petroleum infrastructure in the Gulf states, there would be no oil coming through regardless. The historical analysis that Mearsheimer provides demolishes the intellectual foundation of the entire American war strategy. The idea that strategic bombing alone can win wars has been tested repeatedly throughout modern history, and the results are unequivocally clear. It does not work. Air forces around the world have believed since the 1920s and 1930s that they could independently win wars by hitting the enemy homeland, its economy, its population, its military forces, bringing countries to their knees with air power alone. This theory was tested in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in countless conflicts since. The verdict of history is unanimous. Strategic air power by itself cannot win a war against a determined adversary. It simply cannot. When America invaded Iraq in 2003, the Air Force pounded the country with shock and awe before ground forces moved in. But to achieve regime change and win a decisive victory, land power was essential. Ground forces had to be deployed. Air power alone could not do it. Fast forward to the present conflict, and what do we see? A campaign with no boots on the ground, relying entirely on strategic bombing to achieve objectives that strategic bombing has never achieved in the entire history of warfare. The administration talks about going up the escalation ladder, about punishing Iran more than ever before. What they are saying is that they are going to win this war with air power alone. The historical record, Mearsheimer emphasizes, is unequivocally clear that this will not work. The warnings that were provided to President Trump before this war make the decision to proceed even more inexplicable. General Connie, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whom Trump himself handpicked for the position, told the president that the United States did not have a viable military option. This was Trump's own general brought out of retirement and elevated specifically because Trump trusted him. The National Intelligence Council, a separate body, conducted a study before the war concluding that regime change was unlikely and a quick end to the conflict was not achievable. Two flashing orange lights, if not red lights, were directly in the president's face, and he just ignored them. The literature on air wars, sanctions, and regime change is vast and accessible to anyone who cares to consult it. The conclusions are not complex or contested. Air power alone does not win wars. Sanctions have real limits. Regime change is wickedly difficult, almost impossible without ground forces, and extremely difficult even with them. This scholarship is unequivocal. Yet the administration proceeded as if none of this knowledge existed, as if the laws of strategy could be suspended by American exceptionalism or Israeli promises. The role of Prime Minister Netanyahu in pushing America into this catastrophe deserves particular attention. If there was one person telling Trump that this was all going to work out in a magical way, that quick military victory was achievable, that the Iranian regime was vulnerable and would collapse if hit hard enough, it was Netanyahu. The Israeli prime minister has been arguing for years that all America needed was the courage to really hit Iran hard and pursue regime change. He has been trying to drag the United States into war against Iran by promising a great victory. Every previous American president, including Biden, understood that this was a trap and avoided falling into it. Trump did not. The 12-day war in June 2025 provided a preview of everything that is now unfolded. Decapitation did not work in that war. Escalation dominance did not exist in that war. It was the Israelis and Americans, not the Iranians, who wanted to end that conflict after 12 days. What more evidence did anyone need that this approach would not succeed? Yet Trump jumped in anyway, apparently convinced by Netanyahu's promises that this time would be different. The same strategy that failed in 12 days would somehow succeed if applied for longer and with more force. Mearsheimer's assessment of Trump's mental state and relationship with reality is perhaps the most alarming element of his analysis. The president constantly says things that are simply not true. He claims Iranian weapons are all inaccurate when in fact they have ballistic missiles and drones that are highly accurate. He claims Iran has Tomahawk missiles, which is not remotely plausible. He tells stories about how the United States decimated Iran's nuclear capability last year, but now we discover that Iranian 60% enriched uranium survived, despite all the bombing. The pictures in Trump's head do not correspond to reality. And when a leader operates with false beliefs firmly embedded in his brain, understanding how he could be bamboozled by Netanyahu becomes easier. The contrast with Iranian leadership could not be more stark. The Iranians are rational, strategic thinkers. The foreign minister is impressive. The regime thinks logically and understands strategy. You do not have to like the Iranian government or agree with its policies to recognize that its leaders know what they are doing. They prepared methodically for this conflict. They anticipated American strategies and developed countermeasures. They positioned their assets to survive initial attacks and maintain the capacity for prolonged resistance. When you compare this to the impulsive decision-making, the false beliefs, and the apparent inability to understand basic strategic principles that characterizes the American side, you understand why Mearsheimer believes the United States has already lost. The Russian dimension of this conflict adds another layer of Iranian advantage that American planners apparently failed to consider. Russia is providing intelligence to Iran that helps it wage the war and limits what America and Israel can do defensively. The incentives for Moscow are obvious. Every day this war continues is a day when American attention and resources are diverted from Ukraine. The demand for Russian oil and gas increases as Persian Gulf supplies are disrupted. The United States is even allowing India to buy more Russian oil because Indian energy needs cannot be met from the Gulf. Economically and strategically, this war is wonderful news for Russia. Both Russia and China have deep-seated interests in seeing Iran defeat the United States and Israel. If you were playing Russia's hand or China's hand, you would want to see the United States suffer a humiliating defeat. The incentives for Moscow and Beijing to help Tehran are enormous. The implications for the Gulf states that allowed their territory to be used for attacks on Iran are becoming increasingly dire. These countries thought they were buying security through their alliance with Washington. They have discovered instead that they purchased vulnerability. The American bases that were supposed to protect them have made them targets. The sophisticated defense systems they bought have proven inadequate against Iranian capabilities. And now they face the possibility that Iran will exercise its assured destruction capability against their essential infrastructure, leaving them without water, without petroleum revenue, without the foundations of their modern states. Dmitry Medvedev was right when he said these countries have allowed themselves to be used as human shields while America protects only Israel. The European position in this conflict illustrates the complete subordination of European interests to American dictates regardless of cost. The economic consequences for Europe if this war escalates would be catastrophic. European elites understand this. They wish the war had never started. But they continue to support the American effort, failing to condemn what Mearsheimer correctly identifies as a brazen war of aggression, the assassination of a foreign leader, crimes that would be condemned instantly if committed by anyone other than the United States and Israel. The Europeans lick America's boots because they fear abandonment, but their subservience purchases nothing. President Trump views Europeans with contempt and will not go out of his way to protect their interests. Mearsheimer suggests that Europe would be better served by pursuing what he calls the Spanish model, playing hardball with the United States rather than cowering before it. Trump is a classic bully, and the only way to deal with a bully is to stand up to him, show weakness, and he will walk all over you, which is precisely what he does with the Europeans. But the European brain has been grooved to think that subservience to America is the only option. They have not figured out that with Trump, subservience buys nothing except contempt. The question of how this war ends remains unanswerable, which is precisely Mearsheimer's point about the absence of an off-ramp. Iran has no incentive to settle on American terms. The longer the war continues, the more desperate America becomes, and the stronger Iran's negotiating position grows. Tehran will demand sanctions, relief, reparations, perhaps complete American withdrawal from the region. Washington imagined dictating terms to a defeated adversary. Instead, it faces the prospect of accepting terms from an adversary that has demonstrated it cannot be defeated. The only scenario Mearsheimer can envision that might force America to end the war quickly is if the effects on the international economy become catastrophic enough that continuation becomes impossible. But even that scenario would not be a victory. It would be caving into the Iranians, accepting that the entire enterprise was a failure and that Iran emerged from the conflict stronger than when it began. I want to hear your thoughts on Professor Mearsheimer's assessment that the United States has already lost this war. Do you believe American leadership will eventually acknowledge the reality he describes, or will they continue escalating in pursuit of a victory that history says is unachievable? What does it mean when America's most respected strategic thinkers say what Iranian leaders have been saying all along? Drop your comments below. The broader implications of Mearsheimer's analysis extend far beyond this immediate conflict to questions about American power and its limits in the emerging multipolar world. For decades, the assumption underlying American foreign policy has been that sufficient application of military force could achieve any objective Washington desired. This assumption has been tested repeatedly and found wanting in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now most dramatically in Iran. The pattern is consistent: initial military success followed by prolonged resistance, mounting costs, eventual withdrawal or accommodation with adversaries America claimed it would never negotiate with. Iran represents the clearest demonstration yet that this pattern cannot be broken by escalation alone. The comparison Mearsheimer draws between Iranian and American leadership deserves extended consideration because it illuminates why this conflict has unfolded as it has. Iranian leaders think strategically. They plan for contingencies. They develop capabilities that address specific vulnerabilities in adversary defenses. They position their nation to absorb punishment while maintaining the capacity to inflict unacceptable costs in return. This is rational, calculated, sophisticated strategic behavior. American leadership, by contrast, appears to operate on assumptions that bear little relationship to reality. Trump believes Iranian weapons are inaccurate when they demonstrably are not. He claims Iran has Tomahawk missiles when this is impossible. He asserts that last year's bombing destroyed Iranian nuclear capability when enriched uranium survived intact. These are not differences of interpretation, but departures from observable fact. The role of ideology and wishful thinking in American strategic failure deserves attention. There appears to be a belief in Washington that because America is the most powerful nation on earth, its power must be sufficient to achieve any objective. When reality contradicts this belief, the response is not to adjust the belief, but to insist that more power will eventually produce the desired result. This is not strategy. It is magical thinking dressed in military terminology. Iranian planners, by contrast, began from realistic assessment of their situation. They understood that they could not match American conventional military power, so they developed asymmetric capabilities that could impose costs America was unwilling to bear. They built underground facilities that could survive bombardment. They developed precision missiles that could overwhelm defenses. They cultivated regional allies who would fight alongside them. They planned for exactly the scenario now unfolding. The question of why Trump ignored explicit warnings from his own military and intelligence advisors remains puzzling unless understood through the lens of psychological factors that Mearsheimer hints at but does not fully explore. A president who believes things that are demonstrably false, who tells stories that bear no relationship to reality, who cannot distinguish between wishful thinking and strategic analysis. Such a president is not merely uninformed, but operating in a different relationship with truth than rational policymaking requires. Netanyahu apparently understood how to exploit this vulnerability, promising quick victory and regime collapse to a leader predisposed to believe that American power could achieve anything. The implications for American credibility and alliance relationships extend beyond this immediate conflict. If the United States cannot achieve its stated objectives against Iran despite unlimited application of air power, what does that mean for American security guarantees worldwide? Taiwan observes this conflict with intense interest, calculating what American protection would actually mean if China decided to act. South Korea watches American missiles and air defense systems being depleted in the Middle East and wonders about the protection promised against North Korea. European allies see American forces committed to a conflict that serves Israeli interests while European interests are ignored or actively damaged. The fabric of American alliance relationships, already strained by Trump's erratic behavior, frays further with each day that Iranian missiles continue to fly despite American bombardment. The economic dimensions that Mearsheimer emphasizes deserve extended consideration because they may ultimately force the resolution that military strategy cannot achieve. 20% of global oil and gas flows through the Persian Gulf. Disruption of that flow produces cascading effects throughout the world economy. Oil prices spike, inflation accelerates, supply chains collapse, recessions spread. If Iran exercises its capability to destroy Gulf state petroleum infrastructure, if the desalination plants that provide water for millions of people are targeted, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate region. Global economic stability depends on this conflict not escalating further. Yet the logic of American strategy pushes toward exactly that escalation. The position of the Gulf states has become nearly impossible. They allowed American forces to use their territory believing they were purchasing security. They have discovered that they purchased instead a position on the targeting list of a nation that can destroy their essential infrastructure at will. The water that sustains their populations, the petroleum that funds their economies, all of it lies vulnerable to missiles that American defenses cannot reliably intercept. Iran has offered them a path out. Cease allowing attacks from your territory, and the attacks on you will stop. But accepting that offer means defying Washington at a moment when American pressure is intense. They face choices with no good options, trapped by decisions made years ago that cannot now be reversed. The civilization that has endured for 2,700 years, that prepared methodically for exactly this confrontation, while America assumed its power was unchallengeable, that continues to fight and strike and resist despite everything the world's most powerful military can throw at it, has demonstrated once again that it cannot be conquered. The missiles that continue to fly from Iranian territory, the allies that continue to attack American and Israeli targets, the infrastructure that continues to function despite bombardment. All of this represents the vindication of Iranian strategic planning and the failure of American assumptions. Professor Mearsheimer's assessment will not be welcomed in Washington. It contradicts everything the administration wants to believe and everything it tells the American public. But Mearsheimer was right about NATO expansion when everyone dismissed his warnings. He was right about Ukraine when optimistic predictions of quick Russian defeat proved unfounded. His track record of uncomfortable accuracy deserves attention, especially when he says there is no off-ramp and the United States has already lost. The strategic brilliance of Iranian preparation becomes more apparent with each passing day. While Washington assumed that shock and awe would produce quick capitulation, Thrawn planned for prolonged resistance. While American strategists believed that decapitation would produce regime collapse, Iranian institutions were structured to function without any single leader. While Israeli planners promised that bombardment would break Iranian will, Iranian society was steeled by decades of adversity that had already demonstrated its resilience. The contrast between fantasy-based American planning and reality-based Iranian preparation explains why this conflict has unfolded as Mearsheimer describes rather than as Trump and Netanyahu promised. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand why one of America's most respected strategic minds says what Washington refuses to acknowledge. I'm Michael Harris. Professor John Mearsheimer has delivered a verdict on this conflict that confirms what Iranian resilience has demonstrated daily since the war began. The United States cannot win with air power alone. Iran has options that cannot be countered. The Gulf states are catastrophically vulnerable. There is no off-ramp, and the longer this war continues, the worse America's position becomes. The strategic brilliance that characterized Iranian preparation contrasts devastatingly with the delusions that drove American decision-making. History will record that Iran was right and America was wrong, that the Islamic Republic outthought and outfought the combined power of the United States and Israel, and that a nation that refused to submit proved once again that determination can triumph over raw power. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and understand that what Mearsheimer says from Chicago, Iranian leaders have known all along in Thrawn.